Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. Blood Borders, the Iran-Iraq War, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, The Road to War. In order to understand the Iran-Iraq War, it is important to examine the events that led up to it. While the war officially began in 1980, its roots can be traced back decades to the aftermath of World War I. At the heart of the conflict were two major issues: territorial disputes and religious differences. Iraq and Iran share a long border, and disagreements over where exactly that border lies have been ongoing for years. In addition, the two countries have different religious traditions. Iraq is predominantly Sunni Muslim, while Iran is majority Shia. These differences had been simmering for some time, but they were exacerbated by a number of other factors. One of the most significant was the overthrow of Iran's monarchy in 1979. This event, known as the Iranian Revolution, led to the establishment of an Islamic republic and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini as the country's new leader. Khomeini was highly critical of Iraq's secular government, which he saw as corrupt and oppressive. He encouraged Iraqi Shia to rise up against their government, and this led to a number of violent clashes in cities such as Basra and Najaf. Iraq, for its part, felt threatened by Iran's new regime. Saddam Hussein, who had been in power since 1979, saw Iran's Islamic Revolution as a direct challenge to his own authority. He feared that Iran would attempt to export its brand of Shia Islam to Iraq, potentially inciting an uprising against his government. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Iraq had long-standing territorial disputes with Iran. In particular, Iraq claimed sovereignty over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which forms the boundary between the two countries near the Persian Gulf. Iran, however, argued that the boundary should be further to the east, giving it control over more of the waterway. Tensions between the two countries came to a head in September 1980, when Iraq launched a surprise invasion of Iran. The reasons for the invasion remain a matter of debate. Some scholars argue that Saddam Hussein was hoping to take advantage of Iran's political instability and annex some of its territory, while others suggest that he was simply seeking to bolster his own image and deflect attention from domestic problems. Whatever the motivation, the invasion sparked a brutal 8-year conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives and have profound consequences for the entire region. In conclusion, the road to the Iran-Iraq War was a complex and multifaceted one, involving a range of political, religious, and territorial issues. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the aftermath of World War I, but it was the overthrow of Iran's monarchy and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini that brought the situation to a boiling point. Saddam Hussein's fears about Iran's new regime, combined with long-standing territorial disputes, led to the outbreak of war in 1980. Chapter 2, The Battle for Khuzestan. Khuzestan province in southwestern Iran was a key battleground in the Iran-Iraq War. The region was strategically important for both sides, as it was home to much of Iran's oil reserves and provided a vital access point to the Persian Gulf. In this chapter, we will examine the intense fighting that took place in Khuzestan, the use of chemical weapons, and the impact of the war on civilian populations. When the war began in 1980, Iraqi forces quickly invaded Khuzestan and captured several key cities, including Khorramshahr and Abadan. The Iranians responded with a fierce counterattack, and for the next several years the region became a bloody stalemate. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and the fighting was often brutal and intense. One of the most infamous aspects of the battle for Khuzestan was the use of chemical weapons by Iraqi forces. In 1984, Saddam Hussein ordered the use of mustard gas and nerve agents against Iranian troops and civilian populations in the region. The attacks caused widespread death and injury, and left many survivors with long-term health problems. Despite the use of chemical weapons, the Iranians were able to mount a successful counteroffensive in Khuzestan in 1986. With the help of new military tactics and equipment, they were able to push the Iraqis out of many of the cities they had captured earlier in the war. However, the fighting continued to be brutal and costly for both sides. One of the most devastating aspects of the battle for Khuzestan was its impact on civilian populations. The region was home to millions of people, and many were forced to flee their homes due to the fighting. Many also suffered from the effects of the chemical attacks, with thousands dying and many more suffering long-term health problems. The war had a profound impact on the region's infrastructure, economy, and social fabric, and its effects are still being felt today. In conclusion, the battle for Khuzestan was a brutal and costly campaign that played a significant role in the Iran-Iraq War. The region's strategic importance, combined with the use of chemical weapons and the impact on civilian populations, made it one of the most tragic and devastating aspects of the conflict. While the Iranians were eventually able to push the Iraqis out of many of the cities they had captured, the human toll of the war was immense, and its effects continue to be felt to this day. Chapter 3: The Tanker War. While much of the fighting in the Iran-Iraq War was focused on land-based battles, a separate conflict was unfolding at sea. The Tanker War, as it became known, was a campaign of naval attacks by both Iran and Iraq on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. In this chapter, we will explore the economic and geopolitical implications of this aspect of the war, including the involvement of international powers and the impact on global oil markets. The Tanker War began in 1984, when Iraq attacked an Iranian tanker in the Persian Gulf. Iran responded by launching its own attacks on tankers, including those owned by Kuwait, which it accused of supporting Iraq in the war. The attacks continued for several years, with both sides targeting tankers from other countries as well. In total, hundreds of ships were attacked, with many sunk or damaged. The Tanker War had significant economic implications, as the Persian Gulf is a major source of the world's oil. The attacks disrupted the flow of oil from the region, causing prices to rise and leading to fears of a global energy crisis. Countries around the world were forced to find alternative sources of oil, and the Tanker War had a profound impact on the global economy. The Tanker War also had significant geopolitical implications. The involvement of international powers in the conflict was a major concern, as several countries had strategic interests in the region. The United States, for example, was a major supporter of Iraq during the war, and it launched its own attacks on Iranian ships in order to protect oil tankers passing through the Persian Gulf. Other countries, such as the Soviet Union and France, also became involved in the conflict to protect their own economic and political interests. One of the most significant events of the Tanker War was the attack on the USS Stark in 1987. The Stark was a U.S. Navy frigate that was hit by 2 Exocet missiles fired by an Iraqi plane. The attack killed 37 American sailors and led to increased tensions between the United States and Iraq. The incident highlighted the dangers of the Tanker War and underscored the need for international cooperation in the region. In conclusion, the Tanker War was a significant aspect of the Iran-Iraq War that had far-reaching economic and geopolitical implications. The attacks on oil tankers disrupted the global oil market and threatened to plunge the world into an energy crisis. The involvement of international powers, including the United States, added an extra layer of complexity to the conflict. While the Tanker War officially ended with the ceasefire in 1988, its effects are still felt in the region today, and it remains an important chapter in the history of the Persian Gulf. Chapter 4: The Human Toll. War always exacts a heavy toll on civilian populations, and the Iran-Iraq War was no exception. The conflict, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and left countless others with physical and psychological scars. In this chapter, we will examine the human cost of the Iran-Iraq War, including the displacement of millions of people, the use of child soldiers, and the long-term effects on survivors. One of the most devastating aspects of the Iran-Iraq War was the displacement of millions of people. Both sides launched offensives that forced civilians to flee their homes and seek refuge elsewhere. Many were forced to live in refugee camps for years, often without access to basic necessities such as food, water, and medical care. The war also had a significant impact on the region's infrastructure, with hospitals, schools, and other essential services often destroyed or damaged in the fighting. The use of child soldiers was another tragic aspect of the Iran-Iraq War. Both sides recruited children to fight in the conflict, often luring them with promises of money or other rewards. These children were often subjected to horrific conditions, including exposure to violence, abuse, and exploitation. Many suffered from physical injuries or psychological trauma as a result of their experiences. The use of chemical weapons also had a devastating impact on civilians. Many were exposed to mustard gas and nerve agents, which caused widespread death and injury. Survivors of these attacks often suffered from long-term health problems, including respiratory issues, skin conditions, and increased risk of cancer. The Iran-Iraq War had a profound impact on survivors as well. Many soldiers returned home with physical injuries or psychological trauma, often struggling to readjust to civilian life. The war also had significant economic consequences, as the destruction of infrastructure and displacement of people had long-term effects on the region's economy. In conclusion, the human toll of the Iran-Iraq War was immense. The displacement of millions of people, use of child soldiers, and exposure to chemical weapons had profound and long-lasting effects on the civilian population. Survivors of the conflict continue to struggle with the physical and psychological scars of their experiences. The Iran-Iraq War serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact of war on human lives, and underscores the need for continued efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. The Iran-Iraq War officially ended in 1988, but its impact is still being felt in the region today. The war had significant political, economic, and social consequences for both Iran and Iraq, and it contributed to the rise of new extremist groups in the Middle East. In this chapter, we will examine the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, including the political and economic consequences for both countries, the rise of extremist groups, and ongoing tensions between Iran and Iraq. One of the most significant consequences of the Iran-Iraq War was the political fallout for both countries. In Iran, the war contributed to the consolidation of power by Ayatollah Khomeini and the hardline Islamic regime. The war was seen as a test of Iran's ability to resist foreign aggression and defend its revolutionary ideals. In Iraq, the war was a major setback for Saddam Hussein, who had hoped to annex Iranian territory and cement his own power in the region. The economic consequences of the Iran-Iraq War were also significant. Both countries suffered heavy damage to their infrastructure, and the cost of the war was enormous. Iraq was left with a massive debt that it struggled to repay, while Iran faced severe economic sanctions in the years following the conflict. The war also disrupted the global oil market, leading to higher prices and fears of an energy crisis. The Iran-Iraq War also contributed to the rise of extremist groups in the region. The war helped to fuel the growth of Shia extremist groups in Iraq, such as the Mahdi Army and the Badr Brigade. In Iran, the war contributed to the rise of the Revolutionary Guards, a powerful paramilitary force that played a significant role in the country's foreign policy in the years following the conflict. Tensions between Iran and Iraq continue to this day, with ongoing disputes over territory and oil resources. The two countries have had a difficult relationship since the end of the war, with occasional outbreaks of violence and diplomatic tensions. The war also had a significant impact on the wider Middle East, contributing to the growth of extremist groups and exacerbating existing regional tensions. In conclusion, the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War has had significant and ongoing consequences for the region. The war had a profound impact on the political, economic, and social landscape of both countries, and it contributed to the rise of extremist groups in the region. The ongoing tensions between Iran and Iraq serve as a reminder of the ongoing legacy of the conflict, and the need for continued efforts to promote peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.